Your parents couldn't come to your graduation today, the text message read. Emily's party is more important. Daniel Carter stared at the screen for a long moment, the bright morning sunlight reflecting off the glass of his phone as the words settled into something heavier than disappointment. Around him, the university stadium buzzed with celebration. Families filled the rows of bleachers, waving cameras and calling out names as graduates in dark blue gowns gathered on the field. It was early June in Ohio, warm but not yet humid, the kind of clear summer morning that felt like the beginning of something new. Daniel sat alone in his folding chair among hundreds of students, his cap balanced awkwardly on his head while he read the message again. Emily's party is more important. He slipped the phone back into the pocket of his gown and looked up at the stands. Parents leaned over railings, mothers holding bouquets, fathers adjusting camera lenses, younger siblings jumping up and down when they spotted someone they loved. Daniel searched the crowd one more time even though he already knew the truth. No familiar faces. No sign of Robert or Linda Carter. Just strangers celebrating their own children. The announcer's voice echoed across the stadium, warm and proud as he welcomed families to the ceremony, but Daniel barely heard the words. For 4 years he had imagined this day. Not because he expected applause or recognition, but because it was supposed to be the one moment his parents might finally notice him. He remembered the long nights studying in the campus library until it closed at midnight. The part-time delivery job that paid for textbooks and groceries. The winter mornings when he walked nearly a mile through icy sidewalks because he couldn't afford to keep his car running all semester. Through all of it, he told himself that graduation would be different. That his parents would sit somewhere in those stands and see what he had managed to do on his own. A group of students nearby laughed and pointed toward the bleachers where their families waved signs with their names written in bright marker. One girl wiped tears from her face as her mother shouted encouragement from the railing above. Daniel watched the scene quietly, not with jealousy, but with a strange calm that settled slowly in his chest. It wasn't the first time something important in his life had been overshadowed. Growing up, there had always been another event that seemed to matter more. A dance recital for Emily. A birthday celebration for Emily. A school achievement for Emily. His parents often said she needed more support, that she was sensitive and required extra attention. Daniel had accepted that explanation for years. Even when he worked 2 jobs during his sophomore year just to stay enrolled in college. Even when his phone calls home grew shorter and less frequent. Now, sitting among hundreds of graduates waiting to hear his name called, he realized something simple and quiet that he had never said out loud before. His parents had never planned to come. The ceremony began as the orchestra played a slow, ceremonial march, and rows of students started filing toward the stage. Daniel stood when his row moved forward, adjusting the sleeve of his gown as he joined the line. The sun warmed the back of his neck and the applause of strangers rolled across the stadium as the first names were announced. When his turn finally came, Daniel Carter stepped onto the stage, accepted his diploma, and shook the dean's hand while cameras flashed from every direction. Somewhere in the stands, hundreds of families cheered for their children. Daniel heard the noise but did not search for anyone this time. He simply walked across the stage, diploma in hand, knowing that the people who were supposed to be there had chosen to be somewhere else. After the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly drifted toward the parking lots, families gathering for photographs beside the university fountain, while graduates laughed and tossed their caps into the air. Daniel Carter walked across the campus lawn alone with his diploma folder tucked under his arm, moving through clusters of celebration that felt strangely distant, like watching someone else's life from the outside. The bright banners hanging from the lampposts read "Congratulations, Class of 2015," and parents stood proudly beside them taking pictures of their children. Daniel paused near the stone steps of the administration building and checked his phone again. There were several new messages, but none from Robert or Linda Carter. Instead, there was a social media notification. A photo had been posted less than 10 minutes earlier. Emily Carter stood in the center of a decorated backyard wearing a bright red dress and a paper birthday crown while balloons floated behind her. A large banner stretched across the fence that read "Happy 21st Birthday, Emily." Their mother stood beside her smiling widely, holding a cake with tall candles. Their father was in the background grilling hamburgers, laughing with neighbors. Dozens of comments were already appearing under the photo. Friends and relatives congratulated Emily and wished her a wonderful celebration. Daniel stared at the image for several seconds before locking the screen again. The afternoon sun felt warmer now as the stadium emptied behind him. He walked slowly across the campus toward the parking lot where his aging sedan waited under a row of maple trees. The car had more than 180,000 miles on it, and the air conditioning worked only on cooler days, but it had carried him through 4 years of early morning classes and late night shifts. As he reached the driver's door, he noticed a small envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. It was from the university. Inside was a simple note congratulating graduates, and reminding them about the Alumni Association. Daniel placed it carefully in the passenger seat beside his diploma folder, and sat quietly for a moment before starting the engine. The radio came on automatically, playing a cheerful summer song that seemed almost out of place. As he drove away from campus, he passed groups of families heading toward restaurants and cafes for graduation lunches. Some parents carried bouquets while others walked with their arms around their children's shoulders. Daniel drove toward the small apartment he had rented 2 miles from campus, the same place he had lived since his sophomore year when he could no longer afford the dormitory. The apartment building was plain and aging, with faded brick walls and a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. Inside his unit the air smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee. A single window overlooked the parking lot. Daniel set the diploma folder on the small kitchen table and poured himself a glass of water from the sink. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic outside. He sat down and finally opened the folder again, running his fingers along the edge of the paper that represented 4 years of work and persistence. There was no applause here, no celebration waiting. Just silence. Yet the silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt clear, like a moment of understanding that had been building slowly for years. Daniel realized that nothing about this day had been accidental. His parents had not simply missed the ceremony. They had chosen something else, just as they always had. And for the first time in his life, he understood that the path ahead of him would have to be built without expecting them to walk beside him. That evening the apartment grew darker as the sun disappeared behind the line of buildings across the parking lot, and Daniel Carter remained seated at the small kitchen table with the diploma folder still open in front of him. The paper looked simple, almost ordinary, yet every hour he had worked and every quiet sacrifice from the past 4 years seemed folded inside it. Outside, a car door slammed and someone laughed in the distance, but inside the room the silence stayed steady and calm. Daniel leaned back in his chair and let his thoughts drift through memories he had not examined closely before. The pattern had always been there, even when he was younger and did not have the words to describe it. When he was 12 years old he had won a regional science competition at school. The awards ceremony had taken place on a Thursday afternoon, and he remembered standing on a stage very much like the one earlier that morning, scanning the audience for his parents. They had not come that day either. His mother had explained later that Emily had a dance rehearsal that could not be missed. Daniel had nodded and told her it was fine because he believed that was the mature response. When he was 15 he had earned a place on the varsity track team. His first race had been on a cool Saturday morning in early spring, and he remembered looking toward the bleachers again as the runners gathered near the starting line. A few parents sat with blankets wrapped around their shoulders to stay warm. His parents were not among them. That afternoon he returned home and found the living room filled with decorations for Emily's theater performance that evening. His mother had smiled brightly and asked him to help hang banners for her. Daniel had helped without complaining. The memories continued to unfold quietly in his mind like photographs laid across a table. Small moments that once seemed unrelated now fit together with surprising clarity. Emily had never asked for the attention directly. She simply received it as if it were natural. Their parents often spoke about how sensitive she was, how easily she became discouraged. Daniel had always been described differently. Responsible. Independent. Strong. Words that sounded like compliments but often meant that people assumed he did not need much from anyone. A soft vibration on the table interrupted his thoughts. His phone screen lit up with a message from Marcus Hill, the friend who had shared countless late-night study sessions with him during the past 4 years. Marcus wrote a simple sentence that carried warmth and sincerity. "Congratulations, man. You made it. Proud of you." Daniel read the message twice before typing a reply thanking him. Marcus had graduated earlier that afternoon as well and was already celebrating with his family somewhere downtown. Daniel imagined the crowded restaurant tables, the laughter, the photos that would be taken and saved for years. He placed the phone back on the table and stood up, walking slowly toward the window. The parking lot lights flickered on one by one as evening settled over the city. For a moment he watched a family across the lot unloading decorations and balloons from their car, preparing for a celebration in one of the apartments nearby. Daniel did not feel bitterness as he observed the scene. Instead, he felt a quiet understanding that settled deeper than disappointment. Some people grow up surrounded by encouragement, while others learn early how to continue moving forward without it. As he turned away from the window and glanced again at the diploma resting on the table, Daniel realized that the absence of applause had not made the achievement smaller. If anything, it had made the meaning clearer. Everything he had accomplished existed because he chose not to stop. The following morning arrived quietly, carrying the kind of stillness that often follows a long day of emotion, and Daniel Carter woke up in his small apartment as pale sunlight filtered through the single window above his desk. For a moment he lay still on the narrow bed, listening to the distant sound of traffic moving along the street outside, the ordinary rhythm of a city beginning another day. The events of graduation felt strangely distant now, almost like a memory from years earlier rather than just yesterday. He sat up slowly and looked toward the kitchen table where the diploma folder still rested exactly where he had left it. The sight of it reminded him that life was already moving forward whether anyone noticed or not. Daniel walked into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee, standing by the counter while the warm aroma filled the quiet room. His phone rested beside the sink, and when he checked the screen he saw several new notifications from social media. One post caught his attention immediately. It was another photograph from the celebration at his parents' house the night before. Emily Carter stood beside a table covered in gifts and bright wrapping paper while friends gathered around her smiling. Their mother leaned close beside her with an arm wrapped around her shoulders. Their father held up a glass as if making a toast. The caption read, "A perfect birthday for our amazing daughter." Daniel looked at the photo for a few seconds before setting the phone down again. The scene did not surprise him anymore. Instead, it confirmed what the previous day had quietly revealed. The center of their family had always been Emily, and everything else moved around that center like distant objects orbiting a planet. Daniel finished his coffee and began packing a small box with the few belongings he had kept on the kitchen table. There were textbooks, a worn notebook filled with class notes, and a small photograph taken during his freshman year when he and Marcus Hill had stood outside the engineering building after finishing their first semester. In that photo they both looked younger and uncertain about the future. Daniel placed the photograph carefully inside the box and carried it to his car. The morning air was cool and clear as he loaded the box into the back seat. Today he had an interview in Chicago with a young technology company that had recently contacted him after seeing his final research project. The opportunity felt important, not because it promised success immediately, but because it represented a direction that belonged entirely to him. As Daniel started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, he felt a calm determination settle in his chest. The road ahead stretched through miles of highway and unfamiliar cities, yet for the first time he understood that he did not need anyone's approval to continue driving forward. Back in the quiet neighborhood where he had grown up, the birthday decorations were probably still hanging from the fence in the Carter family backyard, balloons slowly losing air as the morning breeze moved through them. Inside that house, his parents and Emily might already be laughing over leftover cake and talking about the wonderful party they had hosted. Daniel imagined the scene for a brief moment before focusing his attention back on the highway ahead. Some people waited their entire lives for recognition from the wrong audience. Daniel had finally realized that his future did not depend on being seen by those who had never really looked. The highway stretched ahead of Daniel Carter for miles as the city skyline slowly disappeared behind him, replaced by long fields and quiet towns scattered along the interstate. The steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires against the pavement created a calm silence inside the car that allowed his thoughts to settle. Chicago was nearly 300 miles away, a journey that felt longer than the distance itself because it represented the first true step into a future that belonged entirely to him. Around midday, Daniel stopped at a small roadside diner just outside Toledo, the kind of place where travelers passed through quickly and no one asked many questions. He ordered a simple sandwich and a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching trucks roll across the parking lot. On the table beside his plate rested a folder containing copies of his resume and the research project that had caught the attention of the technology company in Chicago. The project had started as a final assignment during his senior year, something he had worked on late at night after finishing his shifts delivering food around campus. At the time, he had not expected it to lead anywhere beyond graduation. Yet one of his professors, Helen Brooks, had encouraged him to submit the work to a professional conference where several young companies were searching for new ideas. That was where the invitation for the interview had begun. Daniel finished his coffee and glanced at his phone. There were still no messages from home. The silence no longer felt surprising. Instead, it felt like confirmation that the distance between him and his family was already wider than the miles behind him on the road. When he returned to his car, the afternoon sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting bright reflections across the windshield. As he continued driving north, the landscape slowly changed, the quiet farmland giving way to busier highways and the distant outline of tall buildings appearing along the horizon. Chicago rose gradually from the edge of Lake Michigan like a wall of glass and steel. Traffic grew heavier as Daniel entered the city, and the sound of car horns and passing trains filled the air. He followed the directions on his phone through crowded streets until he reached a modern office building near the river where the interview would take place the following morning. After checking into a small hotel nearby, he walked along the sidewalk for a while, studying the movement of people around him. Office workers hurried between buildings carrying briefcases and coffee cups while tourists paused to photograph the bridges stretching over the water. The city moved with an energy that felt entirely different from the quiet college town he had just left behind. That evening, Daniel sat at a small desk in his hotel room reviewing the notes for his presentation. Outside the window, the lights of Chicago reflected across the dark surface of the river as the city continued moving late into the night. Daniel looked at the documents in front of him and realized that every step that had brought him here had been taken alone. The realization did not feel heavy anymore. It felt steady, like a quiet foundation beneath everything he planned to build next. The next morning, Daniel Carter woke before sunrise as the quiet hum of the city filtered through the hotel window, a distant rhythm of early buses and delivery trucks moving through the streets of Chicago. He sat at the small desk reviewing his notes one final time while the first pale light spread across the buildings outside. The presentation folder lay open beside a cup of hotel coffee that had already grown lukewarm. Daniel read through the pages slowly, not because he doubted his preparation but because he understood how much this single meeting could change the direction of his life. By 8 o'clock he walked across the street toward the glass entrance of the technology company that had invited him for the interview. The building stood tall beside the river, its reflective windows catching the morning sun and casting bright lines of light across the sidewalk. Inside the lobby, several employees moved quickly through the security gates while a receptionist greeted visitors from behind a polished desk. Daniel introduced himself and received a visitor badge before taking the elevator to the 12th floor. When the doors opened, he stepped into a bright workspace filled with rows of desks, computer monitors, and quiet conversations between engineers reviewing code on large screens. The atmosphere felt focused but welcoming, the kind of place where ideas seemed to move quickly from discussion to reality. A few minutes later, a man named Andrew Whitaker approached him with a friendly handshake and led him into a conference room overlooking the river. 2 other team members joined them, and Daniel began explaining the research project he had developed during his final year at the university. As he spoke, he noticed the group leaning forward with growing interest, asking thoughtful questions about the algorithms he had designed and the potential applications for small businesses trying to analyze large amounts of customer data. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, moving naturally from technical details to broader discussions about how young companies could use innovative software to compete with larger corporations. Daniel answered each question carefully, drawing from the months he had spent studying and refining the idea during long nights in the campus library. When the meeting finally ended, Andrew Whitaker smiled and closed the folder containing Daniel's resume. He explained that the company had been searching for someone who combined technical skill with the determination to develop solutions independently. Daniel thanked them for the opportunity and stepped back into the elevator, unsure of what the final decision would be but confident that he had shown them exactly who he was. Outside the building, the late morning sun reflected across the surface of the river as boats moved slowly between the bridges. Daniel stood for a moment watching the water flow past the city before returning to his hotel room. Several hours later, his phone rang while he was reviewing job listings on his laptop. The caller identification displayed a Chicago number he recognized immediately. When he answered, Andrew Whitaker's voice carried a calm enthusiasm that made the words simple and clear. The company would like to offer Daniel a position as a junior software engineer beginning the following month. Daniel thanked him and ended the call with steady composure, but as he set the phone down he realized that the path he had been building quietly for years had finally opened into something real. Daniel Carter began his new job 3 weeks later, stepping into the same glass building beside the Chicago River not as a visitor but as part of the engineering team. The first few days passed in a blur of introductions, training sessions, and quiet observation as he learned how the company operated. The office floor remained busy from early morning until late evening, yet the atmosphere never felt rushed or chaotic. Instead, there was a steady rhythm of collaboration as teams gathered around whiteboards discussing ideas, testing software, and refining solutions for clients across the country. Daniel spent long hours studying the company's systems and writing code that slowly became part of real products used by small businesses trying to understand their customers better. The work demanded patience and focus, but Daniel found satisfaction in the process. Each completed task reminded him that the opportunity he had earned was the result of years spent building skills in silence. Weeks turned into months, and the routine of the city became familiar. Every morning he walked the same path along the river before entering the building, passing commuters with coffee cups and tourists, photographing the skyline. In the evenings he returned to his modest apartment on the north side of the city, where the sounds of trains and traffic replaced the quiet streets of the college town he had left behind. Occasionally he exchanged messages with Marcus Hill, who had accepted a job in another state, and the two friends shared updates about their new careers. Conversations about family, however, rarely appeared. Daniel noticed that his phone remained silent when it came to messages from home. His parents did not call to ask how the new job was going, and Emily did not mention the move to Chicago on social media. At first the silence felt noticeable, but gradually it faded into the background of his life. Work filled most of his time, and the challenges of learning new systems kept his attention focused forward rather than backward. During the second year at the company, Daniel was assigned to a small team developing a data analysis platform that could help local retailers predict customer trends more accurately. The project required months of careful experimentation and problem solving, and Daniel often stayed late reviewing complex patterns in the data. His dedication did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, Andrew Whitaker stopped by Daniel's desk and complimented the improvements he had made to the software architecture. A few weeks later, Daniel received a promotion to senior developer, a role that allowed him to guide younger engineers who were just beginning their careers. By the time 7 years had passed, Daniel Carter had quietly built a reputation within the company as someone reliable and thoughtful, the kind of engineer who approached problems patiently until the right solution appeared. His office overlooked the same river he had first seen the day of his interview, but now the view felt different. The young graduate who had once stood outside that building wondering about his future had grown into someone who understood exactly how far determination could carry a person when no one else was watching. 7 years passed with the quiet consistency of seasons changing along the Chicago River, and Daniel Carter's life gradually settled into a rhythm built on work, discipline, and the steady confidence that comes from knowing exactly what one has earned. By his early 30s he had moved from a small apartment to a modest condominium overlooking a stretch of tree-lined streets not far from downtown. The office building where he had once arrived as a nervous graduate now felt almost like a second home, its glass walls reflecting the same skyline he had watched evolve year after year. Daniel's responsibilities had grown as well. He led a small development team responsible for refining the company's software platform, guiding younger engineers who reminded him of himself when he first arrived in the city. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted along the sidewalks outside the office windows, Daniel finished reviewing a report and leaned back in his chair. The office was quieter than usual because several team members were attending a conference across town. His phone rested beside the keyboard, silent as it had been countless times over the years whenever thoughts of family briefly crossed his mind. Daniel had grown accustomed to the absence of communication. Birthdays passed without calls. Holidays arrived and faded quietly while he shared simple dinners with friends or colleagues instead. The silence had become normal, almost expected. That afternoon, however, the phone vibrated unexpectedly across the desk. Daniel glanced at the screen without much thought, assuming it was a message from work. Instead, he saw a name he had not seen appear on his phone in nearly a decade. Linda Carter. His mother. For a moment Daniel simply watched the screen as it continued to ring, the sound echoing softly through the quiet office. Memories flickered briefly through his mind, not with bitterness but with the calm distance of time. Eventually he answered the call. His mother's voice sounded older than he remembered, softer and uncertain in a way that surprised him. She began speaking quickly, asking how he had been and mentioning how long it had been since they last spoke. Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. After several moments she explained the real reason for the call. Robert Carter had recently retired, and the small family business he once managed had struggled during the past few years. Emily had moved to another state and was dealing with financial problems of her own. The house where Daniel grew up required repairs that they could no longer afford. As his mother spoke, the request slowly revealed itself between the lines of her careful words. They hoped Daniel might be willing to help them. The office window beside his desk reflected the late afternoon sun across the river outside, the same view he had seen on the day he first arrived in Chicago searching for a future. Daniel listened to the end of the explanation before responding calmly. His voice remained steady as he acknowledged the situation, yet he did not offer an immediate answer. The conversation ended politely, but when the call disconnected the quiet office felt different than it had just minutes before. For the first time in 7 years the past had reached across the distance, and asked him to look back. After the call ended Daniel Carter remained seated at his desk for several minutes, looking out through the tall office window toward the Chicago River where the late afternoon light stretched across the water like a quiet reminder of how much time had passed. The city continued moving as it always did, people crossing the bridges, boats gliding slowly along the current, traffic humming through the streets below. Yet inside the quiet office Daniel felt the weight of a decision that reached far beyond the present moment. 7 years earlier he had stood outside this very building wondering whether his life would ever truly belong to him. Now he understood that it did. Later that evening Daniel walked home through cool autumn air, the streets lined with small cafes and bookstores glowing with warm light. When he reached his condominium he placed his briefcase beside the door and stood for a moment in the living room thinking about the conversation with his mother. Her voice had carried something unfamiliar, a mixture of uncertainty and hope that had never been present during the years he was growing up. Daniel did not feel anger as he remembered the past. Time had softened the sharp edges of those memories. What remained was a clear understanding of how life had unfolded and why he had learned to depend on himself. The following morning Daniel made a decision and called his mother back. When Linda Carter answered the phone her voice sounded nervous, as if she feared the answer she might receive. Daniel spoke calmly, explaining that he understood the challenges his parents were facing and that he was willing to help them stabilize their situation. He offered to cover the repairs their house required and arranged for a financial advisor to help them organize their remaining savings so they could live comfortably during retirement. On the other end of the call, his mother grew quiet, and Daniel could hear the faint emotion in her voice when she thanked him. For a moment neither of them spoke. Finally she said something simple that carried more honesty than any words he had heard from her before. She admitted that they had not always seen him clearly when he was younger, and that they regretted many choices they had made. Daniel listened without interrupting. He did not need apologies to validate the years he had spent building his life. What mattered now was understanding. After the conversation ended, Daniel stepped onto the small balcony outside his living room and looked across the city skyline stretching beneath the morning sun. The same determination that had carried him through quiet classrooms, late-night jobs, and empty stadium seats had brought him here. Helping his parents now did not erase the past, but it allowed him to move forward without carrying resentment that no longer served him. Some lessons in life arrive slowly, revealed only through time and distance. Daniel Carter had learned that recognition from others could never define his worth, and that true strength often grows in the quiet moments when no one is watching. As the city continued waking beneath the bright Chicago sky, Daniel understood that the future he had built was not shaped by who failed to stand beside him years ago, but by the choices he made after he stood alone.